The envelope was cream-colored. Thick stock, the kind that costs extra. He slid it across the dining table. The one his mother had picked out. The one she always reminded me had come from her grandmother's estate. And he set it down with the kind of careful deliberateness that told me he'd practiced the gesture. Outside, it was February. The window above the sink was fogged at the corners from the heat inside. I could smell the lamb I'd been braising since 2 in the afternoon. The table was set for 7. His family would arrive at 6. It was 5:47. He said, "I think you know what this is." I looked at the envelope. I looked at him. Then I looked at the window, at the gray February sky pressing flat against the glass. And I thought about the folder I'd left with my attorney 3 weeks prior. The one with the blue rubber band around it. I almost smiled, but I didn't. "Not yet." "Unexpected," he said. "No," I told him. And I meant it. Welcome to calm revenge tales, where quiet people settle the score, and justice takes its time, but always arrives. If you're new here, subscribe. Stay until the end. This one's going to matter. My name is Teodora Vasic. At the time this story begins, I was 34 years old, and the head of compliance and internal audit for a mid-sized logistics firm headquartered in Cincinnati. I had built the role from a junior analyst position over 9 years. I had put myself through the last 2 years of my accounting degree while working full-time at a warehouse that paid $14.20 an hour. I am telling you this not for sympathy. I am telling you because what comes next only makes sense if you understand that I do not wait for people to hand me things. My grandmother, Bakalenka, as everyone called her, had lived in the United States for 41 years by the time I married Radovan Petrovich. She had come from a village outside Novi Sad with $200 sewn into the lining of a coat, and a recipe for walnut roll she kept in her own handwriting on an index card in her apron pocket for the rest of her life. She was 81. She lived in a one-bedroom apartment in Parma, Ohio, on the second floor of a building with a broken elevator that the landlord never fixed. And she climbed those stairs every day without complaint. Radovan's family, his mother Gordana, his brother Milosh's wife Vesna, referred to Bakalenka as the old woman. Not cruelly, exactly. The way people dismiss furniture they didn't choose. They invited her to family gatherings the way you leave a chair in the corner. Technically present, never actually consulted. I drove to Parma every Saturday morning. I brought groceries. We made coffee. We sat at her small kitchen table with its oilcloth cover printed with blue cornflowers, and she taught me things. How to read a room, how to wait, how to fold dough so the layers stay distinct. She would say, "Teodora, a person who watches carefully enough never gets surprised." She said this so many times I stopped hearing it as advice and started hearing it as prophecy. The invitation to the Petrovich family's annual Christmas gathering came in November. As it always did, typed on Gordana's monogrammed stationery. There were conditions, as there always were. Dress formally. Arrive at 5. Bring nothing that needs to be heated. Gordana's kitchen ran on a precise schedule I had not been trusted to join. And this part was new that year, written in a postscript in Gordana's careful cursive. It would be lovely if Radovan's wife came unaccompanied by additional guests, as space was limited. Bakalenka's name did not appear anywhere in that letter. I called Gordana to ask, politely, whether my grandmother might attend. There was a pause on the line. Then, "Teodora, you know how these things are. It's a family gathering." She said it gently, as though she were delivering news about weather. "She is my family," I said. "Of course," Gordana said. "Of course she is." Bakalenka was not invited. I went anyway, for Radovan. Because I had loved him once, genuinely. And because I had made a decision in a courthouse 7 years prior. And I was not someone who walked away from decisions without understanding them first. Bakalenka told me, when I told her I was going, "Go. Watch. Learn what the table is telling you." She was sitting at her cornflower oilcloth table when she said it. She pressed my hand once. And her hand was very small and very dry and very certain. That was the last Christmas gathering I attended. The next one, the one 6 months later, when everything fractured, began with a birthday dinner for Gordana in June. Radovan had told me it would be immediate family only. 6 people. Catered. No need to do anything but show up. He had not mentioned that he'd also invited a woman named Biljana, whom I recognized from his firm's company page, and who was seated next to him when I arrived. I recognized the look on his face when he saw me notice. It was not guilt. It was the calculation of someone deciding whether to acknowledge what was visible, or simply proceed as though it wasn't. He chose to proceed. That night, Gordana said to the table at large, Teodora has always been very independent. The way she said it, the word independent carried the weight of a verdict. I looked at Milosha's wife Vesna across the table. Vesna looked down at her plate. Her hands went very still around her fork, and she did not look up for a long time. The dinner where everything finally broke was in October, 3 months later. Radovan had wanted one last show of normalcy, I think. His parents' 45th anniversary. The whole extended family. The big house in Shaker Heights with the walnut paneling and the portrait of his grandfather above the mantel. I brought Bakalenka. I had not asked permission. I had not announced it. I had simply called her the morning of and said, "Dress warmly. I'll be there at 4. She wore her navy dress, the one with the small pearl buttons. She brought a tin of her walnut roll. We arrived together. Gordana's face, when she opened the door and saw Bakalenka standing beside me on the front steps, did something complicated. There was irritation, and underneath the irritation, something smaller. Something almost like the look a person gets when they realize they've underestimated a situation. It passed quickly. The gathering was 30 people in a room designed for 15. Bakalenka sat in the chair I found for her near the window, and I brought her a plate, and I watched her eat with the precise, unhurried dignity she brought to everything. Several of Radovan's cousins came to speak with her. She charmed them effortlessly. She was, as she had always been, the most interesting person in any room she entered. She just didn't need anyone to know it. At some point in the evening, Gordana announced that the walnut roll had come from a bakery she'd ordered from in Pittsburgh. Bakalenka said nothing. She just looked at her hands in her lap. I said, "Actually, Bakalenka made that. She makes it from a recipe she carried from Yugoslavia in 1983. The room got quiet. Gordana said, "I think there may be some confusion," and kept moving. One of Radovan's uncles, a man named Dord, large and quiet, who had barely spoken all evening, looked directly at Gordana and then directly at Bakalenka, and his mouth opened slightly. He didn't say anything. He looked away. Then Radovan, across the room, said something to Biljana, and I say across the room because she was there again, framed as a colleague, a fact I had decided to file rather than challenge, and they both laughed briefly at something private, and the sound of it was like a door closing. I went to Bakalenka. I said quietly, "Would you like to leave?" She looked at me. She said, "I've been ready to leave for an hour." She said it without bitterness. Just fact. I took her tin, the walnut roll tin, still half full, and I took her coat, and I helped her stand, and we walked to the door together. Gordana was standing near the hallway. She said, "Teodora." Just my name. I looked at her. I said, "I hope the party is lovely." And I meant it without sarcasm, because there was nothing she could take from me in that hallway, and we both knew it. We drove back to Parma. We finished the walnut roll at her kitchen table, under the cornflower oilcloth, and she made coffee, and we sat there for 2 hours, and she told me about her sister, who had died years ago and whose name I had never thought to ask. The months that followed were logistically demanding. I won't pretend otherwise. I moved into a 2-bedroom rental in Lakewood, $1,340 a month, 3rd floor, east-facing windows that caught the morning light in a way I found, to my surprise, genuinely restorative. I rented a truck myself. I made 12 trips up and down a staircase. I paid the deposit from my personal savings account, which Radovan had never had access to, because I had always kept my finances structured in a way that some people had called unnecessarily careful, and which I had called prudent. Bakalenka's elevator in Parma was still broken. I called the landlord 4 times. He was apologetic in the way of people who have no intention of acting. I researched Section 8 transfer processes. I contacted a housing advocacy organization on Lorraine Avenue. I filled out 23 pages of paperwork on a Sunday afternoon and filed them the following Monday. None of this felt heroic. It was just the list of things that needed doing. Radovan called twice. His attorney called once to discuss the terms of the settlement. The figure they proposed was fair to him, I mean. It did not account for the 7 years I had managed, organized, and in 2 instances financially backstopped decisions he had made that I was not credited for. I made a counteroffer. His attorney called back. I referred them to mine. On the kitchen counter in my Lakewood apartment, I kept a manila folder, cream-colored, with a blue rubber band around it. I moved it from the counter to the table when I ate, and from the table back to the counter when I was done. I did not open it at home. It had been prepared by an estate attorney named Patricia Chun, whose office was on West 25th Street, and who had reviewed certain documents of Bakalenka's at my request 16 months earlier, before any of this had begun. Before I had known it would matter. I had simply thought it was the responsible thing to do. Bakalenka's housing transfer was approved in March. She moved to a ground-floor unit in a building in Lakewood, 4 blocks from my apartment. The elevator worked. There was a small garden behind the building where other residents grew tomatoes in the summer. She walked to my apartment on Sunday mornings. I made her coffee the way she'd taught me, strong, with 1 small spoon of sugar, stirred counterclockwise for reasons she had never fully explained, but which I had come to believe were simply her way of remembering who had taught her. One Sunday in April, she brought me a small clay pot she'd bought at a garage sale. It was blue-green, imperfect, slightly lopsided on one side. She said, "I saw it and I thought of you." I put it on my windowsill. I looked at it every morning while my coffee brewed. That same month, Radovan's attorney proposed a settlement that included a clause requiring me to relinquish any claim on a property that had been transferred to Radovan's name before the marriage. A small house in Mentor, Ohio, 1,100 square feet, assessed at $187,000. His family had insisted on the transfer. I had signed off on it at the time, as a gesture of trust. The settlement framed this as a precedent for the division of other shared assets. The logic was that since I had voluntarily stepped back from that property, I had established a pattern of deference that should apply broadly. I looked at that clause for a long time. Then I called Patricia Chun. "If you're still with me, I need to ask you something before we go further. If this story is finding you at the right moment, if you've ever been the person who kept building quietly while someone else kept score, subscribe to Calm Revenge Tales. The rest of this story is the part that matters, and I want it to find you when it's ready." Bakalenka died on the 14th of May. It was not sudden, exactly. She had been slower in the weeks before, quieter, sleeping more, but it was still the kind of thing that happens on a morning when the light through the east-facing windows is particularly good, and there is no logic to it that holds. I was with her. She had asked me, a week earlier, whether I was going to be all right. Not about the divorce. She hadn't mentioned the divorce directly in months. Just, "Are you going to be all right?" I had said yes. She had looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "Good. Then I'm not worried." And she patted my hand twice with her small, dry, certain hand. Those were the last words she said to me about anything that mattered. The clay pot stayed on my windowsill. The manila folder stayed on my counter, rubber band and all. 3 weeks after her death, Patricia Chun called and said, "We're ready when you are." I said, "Schedule it." The meeting was held in a conference room at Patricia Chun's office on a Thursday morning in June, 11 days before the divorce was finalized. Radovan was there. Gordana had insisted on attending, which Patricia had allowed as a professional courtesy. Milosh came as well, though no one had asked him to. His wife Vesna had not come. I noticed that. Patricia placed a document on the conference table. She also placed, beside it, the blue-green clay pot from my windowsill. I had brought it not as a prop but because Bakalenka had given it to me and I wanted it in the room. The document was Bakalenka's will. Patricia read the relevant sections aloud, methodically. Bakalenka had purchased in 1989 a row house in Slavic Village, a neighborhood in Cleveland on a street called Fleet Avenue, for $34,000. She had rented it, consistently for 31 years. She had paid off the mortgage in 2004. She had said it so many times. But that was the first time I'd heard it as a conclusion rather than a lesson. The divorce was finalized 11 days later, on the original terms, the ones before Radovan's attorney had introduced the deference clause, which was quietly dropped. My half of the shared assets amounted to $94,000. Combined with the inheritance, I was solvent in a way I had not been 2 months before. Before Patricia filed the final paperwork, I made one offer. I told Radovan, through our attorneys, that I would agree to a 2-year payment deferral on his share of the jointly owned vehicle if he was experiencing cash flow difficulty in the transition. He declined. That was his right. I proceeded without guilt. Gordana sent a letter 3 weeks after the settlement that was 3 pages long and contained, among other things, the observation that Bakalenka had not always been well regarded by the family. I read the letter once. I placed it in a file. I did not respond. The letter became the last communication I received from anyone in that family, and I found that the silence required no filling. Miloš and Vesna separated the following October. I do not know the details and it is not my story to tell. But Vesna sent me a card at Christmas. Just a card, no message, only her name signed at the bottom in blue ink. I put it on my refrigerator. I have not analyzed it further than that. The house on Fleet Avenue needed a new water heater and some work on the porch railing. I hired a contractor. I raised the rent by $60 when the current tenants renewed, which was still $90 below market rate, and they knew it, and they brought me tomatoes from their garden in August, 6 of them in a paper bag, still warm from the vine. On Sunday mornings, I walk 4 blocks to the building where Bakalenka used to live, because the route passes a bakery, and I stop there, and I buy a walnut roll. Not as good as hers, not even close, and I eat it on the way home with my hands, standing at a crosswalk on a street in Lakewood in whatever weather happens to be occurring, and I think about a woman who crossed an ocean with $200 and a recipe, and the unshakable conviction that watching carefully was its own form of power. The clay pot is still on my windowsill. Every morning, while my coffee brews, I look at it. It is slightly lopsided on one side. I find that I don't mind. Some things don't announce themselves. They just wait. And the people who build quietly, the ones who never needed the acknowledgement to keep going, they're often building something the rest of the room doesn't know to look for. If there's someone in your life who climbs a broken elevator without complaint, who shows up, who presses your hand and says they're not worried about you, call them today. Not a text. A call. If this story stayed with you, share it. Leave a comment. Subscribe so the next one finds you. I'll see you in the next one.